Welcome back. In the last recording, we took a look at creating our first basic cutscene using Sequencer, and we got it to autoplay and to start as soon as the level began. So I made sure to turn off autoplay so that my cutscene isn't going to play immediately, and we're going to start by building a trigger that's going to activate our cutscene when we enter the trigger. Just like before, our trigger is going to be a blueprint that's made off of our trigger box. So I'm going to add a trigger box to the scene. I'm going to go ahead and move my player start quite a bit out of the way so that I don't see my cutscene area from where my player starts. In that same area, I'll create my trigger box that's going to start my cutscene. So quickly add basic trigger box. I'm going to go ahead and scale that trigger box so that it's nice and large and easy to step into. I'm going to take that trigger box that I've created and we're going to make it visible inside of our game so that we can see it. So I'm going to go to rendering. From rendering, we're going to turn off actor hidden in game so that I can see this trigger and walk into it on purpose. Now that I have my trigger box, I'm going to be able to select it and we're going to turn it into a blueprint. I'm going to name mine BP Cinematic Trigger. And we're going to make sure that it's being stored not in our Paragon assets, but in a new folder. So I'm going to right click on content, new folder, blueprints. Here's my cinematic trigger. Under my event graph, we're going to do a couple of different things. One of the things we're going to need to do is create an object that can play a cinematic. So we have a cinematic in our level, but we can't play it yet because we don't have a cinematic player. So I'm going to go ahead and create one, and we're going to store it in a variable. So off of my event begin play, as soon as our object exists, we're going to create. So we're going to create level sequence player. Level sequence player is going to look for a sequence to play. I'm going to want to be able to reuse this trigger over and over again. So I'm going to go ahead and promote that to a variable so that we can look up which sequence to play we want to play and expose that to our designers. So there we go. There's our player. It's loaded a certain sequence in there. We're going to take that value that comes out of there and we're going to save that into a new variable. So I'm going to right click, promote to variable. And this new variable is going to be our player. I'm going to call it sequence player. I guess I'll call it level sequence player. So it's a little easier to understand what it means. I don't need to expose it because we're creating it and saving it like we've done with some other variables in the past. We're just going to be able to use it later on. Now that we have that object, we're going to be able to do something as soon as we overlap our trigger. Well, we're going to want our cinematics to only play once. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to put a do once node. This means that my cinematic will only run once. So we're going to take our player. So here's my level sequence player. Bring that in. And from there, I'm going to tell that player to play. And so now when I overlap the trigger, it's going to just once tell that sequence to play. I'm going to add some additional events that are going to run under certain conditions. So I'm going to create one event for what happens for when my sequence starts. So I'm going to add custom event. And I'll call this sequence begin. And I'll add another custom event, which is going to be when the sequence ends. And what we're going to do here for these sequences is I'm going to add some functionality that's going to turn off control for our player so that our player isn't able to move around, run around, jump up and down. In fact, I'm going to actually hide our player from the screen so that they aren't even being drawn while this cinematic is playing. So when we begin our sequence, when we start playing the sequence, what we're going to do is we're going to grab our player controller. So get player controller. And for player controller 0, when the sequence begins, we're going to change our cinematic mode to true. So cinematic mode, yes. I'm going to turn off, so cinematic mode, yes. Yes, we're going to hide the player. Yes, we're going to turn off the HUD if we had one. Yes, we're going to stop their movement. Yes, we're going to stop their turning. And I'm going to reverse that when the sequence ends. So we're going to get player controller 0. Set cinematic mode. Cinematic mode is going to become false, but we're still going to affect movement and turning. But now they're going to be able to move again. We created these events, but we need to hook them up so that they have a time that they run. So when we begin overlap and we play, this is when I'm going to run sequence begin. But I need to know, when is the sequence over? So the only way I can really check if the sequence is over is I can use my tick, and I can kind of check every frame and say, is the event over? If it's over, then we're going to turn off cinematic mode. But we don't want to use event tick all of the time. Event tick can eat up a lot of resources. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with the event tick off so that our tick won't run. So when I begin playing, I'm going to set actor tick enabled. And I'm going to set that to false. We won't run that tick after we begin playing. So when my sequence begins, I'm going to do the same thing. Set actor tick enabled. Only I'm going to turn the tick on for this object when my sequence begins. Which means once my sequence starts playing, every tick this will run. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to look at the level sequence. So here's my level sequence player. And I'm going to ask my level sequence, are you playing? And every tick, I'm going to do a branch. And this branch says, if I am no longer playing, right? So if is playing is false and I'm not playing anymore, then I'm going to run my sequence end. My sequence end is going to stop the cinematic mode and it's going to turn off the tick. So this logic may be a little confusing or may take a little while for you to think through. So take a moment to really analyze this logic and think about it. When we start our play, we're going to create the sequence player and we're going to turn off our tick. So our tick is not running at the beginning. When someone enters the trigger, only once are we going to play the sequence and go to our sequence begin. Our sequence begin is going to set our cinematic mode and it's going to turn on the tick. When we're ticking, we're checking every frame to see if the sequence is still playing. If the sequence is no longer playing, we're going to go to sequence end, which is going to set our cinematic mode to off, to false, and we're going to stop the tick. So again, this may take a little time to think about what's going on, but this is going to be our trigger. We will compile, save, close. With our trigger selected under our default, we have to choose which sequence we want to play. I'm going to choose to play the master sequence that plays both of those cutscene sequences. Let's save all. We'll press play and we'll give it a try. When I walk into the trigger, it plays my cutscene. So because it was a do once, we're only going to run that trigger once. One thing about our cutscene, however, is that as soon as it started, we were immediately cut to the new camera. We didn't move from our current position to the new camera's position. So the next thing we're going to look at is how to be able to blend from where our game camera is to our cinematic camera. In order to do that, I'm going to open up our sequence here in Sequencer. I'm going to open up our first shot. And here on our camera cuts, I'm going to right click and I'm going to make sure that they can blend. I'm going to go back and I'm going to go ahead and do that on my second shot too while I'm thinking about it. So select my camera cuts and they can blend. When camera cuts are able to blend, you can overlap them over each other and they will move from one to the other. But this also allows them to overlap with our game camera. So if I go back to my first shot, we will find that now that we can blend, at the very beginning, there's going to be this little symbol. It's very hard to see. So even if I zoom way in, it's still incredibly hard to see this little bitty triangle that I can barely overlap. You may notice I had to use the magic of screen cuts to wait until the time that I'm actually able to grab it directly because it's so difficult to grab. You're going to want to make sure that you can see a large amount of your timeline. So I double click to bring it out so I can see this entire timeline. I'm going to grab that tiny little piece and I'm going to drag it out and we'll see that it'll create this little curve. I drag my curve so that it goes half a second. And what that's going to do is it's going to give me a half-second blend from whatever camera I was looking at before. In the case of our game, it's our game camera, to this camera's new position. I can do the same thing at the tail end of our game camera as well. So if I have that selected, I remember I set it by going right-click, can blend. Now, if I go to my object and I go to the very end of my camera, there should be a little one that I can drag and I can bring out how far I want that to be to blend to my new location. And so if you have can blend set, you should be able to grab these tiny little handles and drag them out so that you can see this curve. And this curve is going to be when it blends between the two cameras. So if I press play again, my game starts in game mode, but now when I enter that trigger, it's going to blend from my game camera to my cinematic. So you see how he very quickly went up. And then, of course, he comes out. He plays his drums. The rocks move. And I go back to my game camera to continue my game. Changing the length of those is going to be something you're going to have to work with to figure out what works best, what looks the best. So a lot of times we'll find that it should be much longer than that 1 second or that half second that I set it at. But now it's really hard for me to grab again. So if it takes like 2.5 seconds, we'll see that it'll blend between the two cameras. And that's how we connect our game cameras to our cinematics.